Is that better? Well, that sounds a lot better. Well, to me, certainly, perhaps not to yourselves. And then we got the allocation in on the 14th of February. Now, what was interesting was the process that we went through from the CSR submission. To say that we were badgering the department for a response is probably an understatement. We were onto them at all times, giving lots of information to support the position. So it was a bit of a surprise to get the allocation that we did. I think it would be wrong for me not to say that I was disappointed. So we received a grant allocation of £6.5 million for 1 year, as opposed to £10 million for 3 years. So I was disappointed. However, it's about accepting what we've got and then moving on. So going into the detail of the allocation that was granted, the £6.5 million of core funding was granted, and that was actually a £500,000 increase from the current year. Now, part of that was the department had made an assessment to say that they felt the cost of co-sponsorship, as a consequence of the movement of the NPR regime to the department, they assessed that it would be about £400,000. So a modest increase from 6 to 6.1, but if you take account of inflation, and we've probably all got a view of what inflation is doing at the moment, it's at best modest and potentially even a reduction in real terms. I'm not sure what that's for. When I mentioned before about what we did a year ago, so we were able to mitigate it by utilising reserves, but you can only use reserves once. So the mitigations that we applied a year ago to make the situation workable, first of all, the utilisation of reserves has gone, and secondly, the transfer of the NPR programme to the department also removes that as an opportunity to transfer costs. So what we're faced with is quite a significant task. So that takes us into the business planning side, and so what we're faced with is going back to core principles, understanding exactly what our activities are and what our activities can be, and then building up from base principles. So paragraphs 4.3 to 4.8 within the report identify the high-level objectives that we are endeavouring to follow in the business plan that's been presently constructed and compiled. Normally, we would have a business plan in place, and we'd probably be sharing that with you now. But to get the allocation on the 14th of February means that it is too tight to actually, getting the allocation on the 14th of February, and then also having to accommodate a significant material reduction in activity and expenditure means that we were unable to get the business plan completed and the budget in place. So what was agreed at the board meeting on the 23rd of February is that we put an interim budget in place, which is something that I've never done, but it's something that you have to. We've got a duty to have a funded budget in place by the end of the year or the start of the new year. So again, what we are constructing as we speak is an interim budget for the 3-month period to June. At the same time that budget will be in place, we are implementing as we speak a business planning exercise, which will also then result in a whole series of activities that would bear a strong correlation to the current activities that we have, but once costed and resourced, would then allow us to build up the budget an annualised budget that we would then submit back to the board on the 30th of June. So that's the budget and business planning, and I think then what it then, because of the size of the task that we face, and it is up to the sort of 30, 37, 38% reduction in cost and activity, we've had to introduce a cost control mechanism, which is a reasonable thing to do, and that's just about looking at all activity and saying, is it the kind of activity that we want to conduct, and does it support our longer term objectives? If it does, then that's fine, and we'd encourage you to go through. If it doesn't, like any business, you'd take a step back and think, well, let's have a look at that. So that's, I think, in essence where we are. In terms of the other areas, that what I didn't mention in the allocation was that the ongoing support for the RMP Rail North Partnership Programme was agreed. So that continues for another year. And the other main elements of the budget allocation was, whilst the main part of the NPR programme was transferred to the department, what the department requested was that the modelling function was retained by Transport for the North, and they allocated £1.5 million as a ring-fence grant for the next year to fund that regime, and that's the modelling function will support the MPR programme and support the MPR business case with work engaged by the department. And we are still just finalising the external procurement requirements to support that budget. So I think that's probably in the pipeline. There's quite a lot in there. I've taken the paper as read, but happy to answer any questions that anybody would have.
Thank you very much. Just before I ask for questions on this, I would like some clarity as to, obviously the budget is much restricted, so is much reduced, I should say. So, and I understand there will be some manpower changes. So I'd like to understand that all the staff involved or employees are going to be looked after. Could you just shed some light on that for me?
There's a process we're going through. I mean, first and foremost is let's establish an affordable business plan. Let's agree our activities. If we get our activities agreed, we agree the resources that are required to underpin that and the costs that would underpin that programme. Then there's a process of looking at affordability. Is that affordable or not within the funding envelope that we have? If it is, then we can go forward. If it isn't, we have to go through iteration again. But we need the business plan and we need the structure and the resource that underpins that business plan. That process is ongoing now. I think we're hopeful that it will be concluded by April or early May. So if there are discussions to be had with staff, and I genuinely think there probably are likely to be, that would occur in late April, early May. It's not, I mean, the staff have, or the staff base have been advised that a voluntary redundancy programme may well be offered in the foreseeable future, but that is yet to be concluded. But again, that's a part of a regime that would see a reduced workforce, a leaner workforce being in place going forward.
Thank you very much. I just think it's important, and I think we should note that we do care about the employees of Transport for the North, yeah, and that they will be looked after in the best way possible. Right, I'd like to open this up for questions for Paul. Okay. Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the report that we've had. I mean, clearly the budgetary situation is a very challenging one. It's not, not a great situation in any respect. I do echo what we've just heard. It's so important to look after the people who are working for Transport for the North, and it's encouraging to hear that at least, I suppose, that they're being kept in the loop. Now, I've got a few, four quick questions to asked. So, the first one is on page 20 at 3.2. There's the mention of the fact that future years' funding will be adjusted appropriately depending on Transport for the North's performance in the coming financial year. Do we know how Transport for the North's performance will be judged and what the criteria, what is it that the government is looking for to make sure that we can have, I suppose, be in the best position to ask for funding in future years. Additionally, I'd note at 3.7 there's reference to the fact that we only commit to expenditure when we have a written commitment from the departmental budget holder that they're content to fund it. Seems like a reasonable position to take in the situation that we're in. One worry I'd have is will that slow down the work that needs to happen, and to what extent can that be mitigated and taken into account? Additionally, when putting together this this sort of financial plan for the next year, to what extent has it been possible to take into account inflation, and particularly given recent events in the last couple of months that will inevitably lead to inflationary risks, and so potentially this could be a difficult year from that perspective. How will that affect the work that Transport for the North is doing? And finally, on page 22 at 4.5, where we've got the sort of targeted outcomes of economic performance, improved productivity, inclusivity, health and access, and better quality of life. I think these are really important and very much what we should be focusing on. There is a question, though, that in an increasingly tight budgetary situation, how will Transport for the North approach situations where these come into conflict and where there may have to be decisions made to prioritise one or the other, and just how has that been given full consideration?
So 3.2, just in order that you raised them, 3.2, the simple answer to that question is no, we don't. That narrative, as quoted, was within the funding letter. Now, Martin and the chair of the board have met with the Secretary of State, I think in an attempt to start to begin to manage what's behind that. But in terms of clarity, I'm not aware that there is a clearly articulated set of targets that says if you do 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, we'll then grant you funding in a certain way next year or not. I think it could be read both ways. It could be read perform badly and you don't get money, or it could be read in a way that perform well and you get more. But that's part of the problem that I think we face. In terms of 3.7, which was around, if you just remind me again the question about, it was about grant first, and yeah, it was grant and then spend. But unfortunately, we're constrained by, we're effectively 100% funded by the department, with the exception of an element of reserves that are relatively modest now. And we're going into an environment whereby we've got ring-fence grants that won't contribute to reserves. If anything's not incurred on a ring-fence grant, it gets repaid. We'll have a core allocation of anywhere in the region of 6.5, or in fact it will be 6.5 for this year. So there's little opportunity to bank stuff away. So what we've got is we've got grant and we've got activity, and they'll match. And that's the environment that we face. In terms of inflation, we've factored it in where we can. We've made assessments for the cost of living increases, just as an example, but they are just provisions. They'd be subject to agreement with the unions. And I think generally that's the main cost that we're exposed to, because I think a lot of our commissions tend to be, or probably will tend to be going forward, people-based. So again, we're going to be faced with that situation of suppliers facing the exact same pressures. So we've got to make an assessment of inflation, but I think what I would like to do is to start building the case, probably towards the autumn, of feeding back to the department and to the Secretary of State, and giving a better indication of some of these anticipated outturns. If we're faced with 5% inflation, can we weather effectively a 5% reduction in our costs and activities? And I don't think the answer is yes. So I think it's that two-way process that we've got to work with the Secretary of State and the department to try and get a more realistic funding allocation, I think. And then in terms of 4.5, I think what you've described as the business planning process, we actually had a session yesterday along those same lines, which is, everybody comes forward with a whole series of activities, and then you discuss each activity and establish, well, how does it sit in relation to other activities? And if there are some activities that could be deferred or possibly cancelled, then that's considered. But the interrelationships between the various work programmes and the individuals who are managing them, that comes out as part of a business planning process. So it is happening, and it's happening well. I think the proof will be in the pudding, which is a business plan that gets approved at the 30th of June, that demonstrates with a clear set of objectives, and if there are conflicts, then they'll get identified as well. Is that, hopefully I've given you enough. I don't know whether, Tim, would you want to? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hughes.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I think we all comprehend the severely challenging nature of budget making for TFN this year. It does appear that the government is determined to impose its own designs for the North on the people and the organisation to the north, contrary to even the facade of any sort of devolution. However, we should see how things progress. If we get the rewards that you hinted might possibly appear, then maybe there'll be some eating of words. I don't know. In terms of questions, TDF is not explained at all in the report. Its function, where it comes from, or even what the initials stand for. And there's a little number 2 by it. And notice that there are quite a few of these footnote references, but there are no footnotes. So I don't know whether we've missed something here, Chair, or whether one is just assumed to know what this is about. So explanation of TDF would be helpful, please. The concept of Transport for the North being an NPR co-sponsor, I'd like a bit more detail about how the government envisages that happening and how TfN envisages it working. The loss of funding for the northern infrastructure pipeline, I'd like to know how seriously this is likely to affect TfN's aspirations. Is it a core funding loss, or is it something we can sort of work around, as you know, you've been hinting that you obviously you'll have to do? Do we have any idea whether the government or the department thinks that TfN is performing badly, or is this idea of performance-related assessment and hence funding really just the big stick to make us go more in the directions that are desired? And finally, I'd like to know something about the possible impact of the Trans-Pennine rest time working industrial action, because I noticed the letters that we get from the chief executive of Trans-Pennine become more and more serious as each weekend passes, or this could be part of publicity assault. But actually, if that company is going to be undermined, then we want to know what effect it's going to have on the North as a whole and on TfN's likely intervention. This may be for one of the other officers to report on, but it will likely to have an impact on the budget as well. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much for suggesting that somebody else addresses question number 5, but I think I was probably struggling in that area, but hopefully I'll look to someone there in a moment. TDF stands for Transport Development Fund. It's the fund that was required to support the NPR programme. Sorry?
And sorry, its function is?
It's a fund. It's a fund that's used to fund infrastructure schemes. That's what it is.
So, okay, not ring-fenced for any specific...
Whether the fund is ring-fenced or not, I don't know, but the allocation that we got from the Transfer Development Fund to fund the NPR programme is ring-fenced. Okay. So that was, it's a grant that's, I think the original allocation letter a year ago said 75, then it became 67 because part of it went across to HS2. And then of that 67, I think the end spend was somewhere in the 40s exactly.
I think just a very brief explanation of that in the report would have been really helpful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Okay. I appreciate that. If the footnote's in there, there should be a recommend. It's an omission to our drafting. In terms of the NPR co-sponsorship arrangements, that is currently being worked on. Exactly what is expected, I think the department probably have a view on what they would like it to be, which is good and encouraging, but I think equally Martin and the board have got their own view of what it'd like to be, and I think it's how those two come together. I think it's fair to say that they're not together as we speak, but I couldn't comment about how far apart they are. But it's critical to get an effective working relationship, not a token gesture. I don't think anyone's intention is for that to be the outcome. So I am aware that there are draft terms of conditions that have been exchanged, but it is still a high priority item to clarify in the immediate future, because I think the view is that body would meet relatively soonly, just to begin to try and find its feet. In terms of pipeline, would you Tim be able to give a bit of a steer on the pipeline side of it? I mean, it isn't core funding. My understanding is it was funding that was to support local authority schemes.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So what was described as a budget to take forward a Northern Infrastructure Pipeline was an additional thing that TfN recommended to government, that was an additional function that TfN could start to take forward. And part of our statutory role is to suggest functions that could be devolved to TfN as a statutory subnational transport body. What it would have done is really built on TfN's emerging strengths and capabilities, particularly around analytics, particularly around scheme development, not least through the work that we've done on Northern Powerhouse Rail, and been a real vehicle to really support local transport authorities in terms of capability, capacity, and being able to bring forward schemes more quickly, potentially using TfN's sort of expertise and analytical capability. That's something we're still exploring. That there was actually some additional funding from the department to do 1 or 2 other things, which we will be able to take forward some of that through the additional funding received through DFT. We will obviously look through the business planning process at what we can do to support LTAs in scheme development, because I think that's very much part of Martin's vision for the organisation moving forwards, and something where we think we can add a lot of value. But as Paul set out, we are now extremely limited in our capacity to take lots of that forward next year. So some of that I think will come, not necessarily, some of it will come in the next financial year, but it will be about where we go in the years beyond that.
Neil, is that okay? If you are you still waiting for one question?
Well, the 2 questions, the question of performance, performance assessment, and the issue of TransPennine.
I'll have a go at the 4th question around performance, and I think again it's not clear what is expected by the department, but again we're a statutory body which is set up with a set of statutory duties, and our job is to deliver those duties. However, it is recognised that we are 100% funded by the department, so there has to be an interface there. I think it's fair to say there's been some transition in the last year, 18 months. We have a new chief executive, we have a new chair, and so I think the relationships are being rebuilt. But my personal opinion is that I think there's an acknowledgement that we've got a job to do, and I think the real challenge for us is to accept the fact that we need to take a step back, possibly become a leaner organisation, but then reshape and go again. So that's the general feeling within the company. And then in terms of TransPennine, I've got...
Yeah, forgive me, Councillor, just to clarify, is this about the reductions in services over the weekend as a TransPennine route upgrade?
It was supposed to have been a short-term thing, but it seems to be relentless and ongoing.
Ah, okay. I think we may need to write to the committee about this, actually, because we don't have a rail officer present today. My sense is it's a combination of, there is a lot of work in TfN going on around the recovery of rail services, and it's linked to that, but yeah, engineering work is now taking place on the route as well. So it's a combination of those 2 factors.
So we'll get a letter on this, will we? Chair?
Yeah,
okay,
all right.
Thanks. Right, thanks. Great.
Councillor Cooper.
Thanks. Thank you for this. My reading of this is that the reduction in funding is that it's going to substantially reduce the scope of what TfN is capable of doing. So where previously we might have got involved with the integrated ticketing, for example, or the work that's done on Northern Powerhouse Rail, any kind of scheme development stuff, all of that is really over, isn't it? By the sounds of it, except to a limited extent, and instead we'll be focusing on the research aspect, the strategy stuff, and that'll be sort of the extent of our role. And if I've got that right, in your view, with the funding level that we've been awarded with here, is it possible for Transport for the North to continue to carry out all of its statutory functions across the size of the area that it is?
Addressing the end question first, I think the statutory obligations are quite broad. So I think the answer is yes, we can. I think what it comes down to is then what can we achieve within the envelope that we've got. That's going to be the critical task that we engage with over the next 2 months, and establishing exactly what the activities are that we believe are prioritised activities. I think it's also interesting. I think we had a lengthy session about this yesterday. Is that it's not we have no one consistent year base. It's what we do in this year. The year forthcoming will be refreshing the STP, which is the strategic transport plan. The following year we'll be doing other activities. So again, it's about mapping out the activities over a longer window, and then it being matched to the level of funding that we have. But I think Martin, as the Chief Executive, has expressed the view to start working more closely with partners to establish whether there's any opportunity there, which again, I think it's an opportunity that we need to consider. Whether that means all the activities that you mentioned stop or cease, I generally don't know at this stage. That would come out of the business planning process. But I think the statutory duties will be delivered. I think the key is about the balance. It's a balance of people and activities, and that balance is yet to be concluded.
Are there any more questions for Paul? Sean.
As you may have guessed, yes, there are. I reiterate my first question from the last meeting. Why are we all here when it seems that it's a hollowed out shell now? I don't think this represents an effective medium at all. I don't think it's fit for purpose. I think the point you just made, will it be able to carry out its statutory duties? If the statutory duties are minimal, yes. If it's what everybody expects us to really do, no, because it had all the funding taken out. I really have massive sympathy for the staff here. They came in with the intention of delivering a first-rate transport for the north. That can't happen due to the government's decisions on the rail plan. We just basically, Chair, I mean, we are at the stage where I ask the question, what can we actually do that's going to help to deliver better transport for the north, whether it be rail, buses, roads, water, anything. At the moment, we can deliver next to nothing, because the budget's next to nothing, and the capability of delivering on that budget is next to nothing, because you're having to think about getting rid of key people. We're told there's nobody here to deal with rail. This is, this has been one of the core issues of what we've been doing ever since we started on this programme. We have got nowhere. I asked the question at the beginning of the last meeting, why are we doing this when they've cut us to pieces? And I'm afraid I have to ask that question again. Is it fit for purpose? My answer is no. As a scrutiny chair of something like 20 years experience, and as a planning chair, there's no planning been going on by government. There is some planning, however, I do tell a lie, not for transport for the north, but if anybody caught the architecture that the railways built last night, showing Curzon Street station projections for Birmingham, where they've taken a 1 mile long piece of Birmingham that's the width of a football pitch and spending billions on redeveloping it, including redeveloping a building. Well, they're trying to actually put in a roundhouse that was demolished in 1860. So how much is that going to be adding in to the cost that could have been coming up to do something up here? I'm sorry, Chair, this just really is beyond a joke. We've all wasted our time for many years trying to do this, and governments seem to have completely ignored the north entirely. Well, maybe they haven't ignored Cleveland, but that's about all, because Ben Houchin seems to get all the money for anything that's forthcoming. He goes to the opening of a bag of crisps. I used to, at least when I was Lord Mayor, restricted to the opening of a bag of family-sized crisps. But he goes to everything and gets funding for it. We have not got anything that is really substantial here to be able to do it. Welcome to the RMS Titanic, where we are merely shuffling the shuffling the deck chairs on the deck before it goes under. There's no money to deliver anything. Let's be totally upfront. And why are we wasting our time and wasting these good people's time when they could be doing other jobs that would deliver more effectively for them and for the country and for the North? Because Transport for the North is a joke. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Sean.
And it's rather difficult for you to come up with an answer to that when I do now.
Yes, thank you, Sean. I'm not going to ask Paul to comment on that at all.
I'm not either.
So what I am going to say is that your comments are noted. However, at the moment, we are the scrutiny board of what this effectively of papers that actually go to the main board, and as such, there is still quite a lot. There's still quite a lot of money in the budget, but it depends how it all gets worked through. But at the end of the day, I do have my concerns about how effective Transport for the North can be. However, I thank you for your comments. So, Paul, I have a couple of comments for you rather than direct questions. So, one of my big concerns with all the papers that we receive here is, and I think this is an opportunity for us, because though I bear in mind that you've got limited resources, and perhaps more limited now, and perhaps even limited access to data. But one of my biggest concerns is that when we get strategic papers must contain quantitative information, not just qualitative information. I'd like to see metrics that give us a scalar of importance. I'd like to see units of measure. I'd like to know what the size of the prize for achieving, let's say, Lucy's transport strategy. Just to give an example, I'm not suggesting it's not in there, Lucy, before you get upset. But what I am saying is that I do think that we need to be able to read the papers very quickly. Numbers can paint a picture for us very quickly. I'd like to see tables, charts and graphs and not just prosing reports. One of the reports we had to read in preparation for this meeting, and I don't mind reading, but it was 88 pages long, and I do think that we could have probably taken space out of that by using effective tables, graphs, charts, etc. One little thing for Councillor Hughes is I do like the fact that there's lots of references. However, if you are going to put annotations in and glossaries, then please just make sure they're added so that Councillor Hughes and all the rest of us can keep up with the programme. And just going back, size of the prize, I actually mean what's the ambition that we are looking at, because I think that addresses Councillor Chater's point. It also addresses perhaps Councillor Salter's point. So I'm very keen that we have at the moment we have an opportunity where things are being changed. We're having to look at things in a slightly different way, but perhaps we can look at how we can put together more effective reports. I appreciate you will be looking for efficiencies and productivities. So that's just a general comment. I don't expect you to answer, so that's fine. It's just something that I feel is important, and it also helps everybody in this room feedback information for you, and we actually understand how important, say, aviation is versus road, because the scale is in these things. What I'd like to just ask that's noted as a result of this item, and I'd like agreement from the people in the room here, the committee, but we note that we want to, when we get the plan, which will be probably at our next, well, we won't see this next plan until the meeting in June. So, but I would like to see in that plan that there is some reference to how staff and that staffing resources are going to be managed, and also how, if there has to be any, let's say, changing in manpower, that is managed sympathetically. I think it's important that we also note, picking up Councillor Shater's point, that the criteria for which Transport for the North is going to be measured against, we actually know what that criteria is. I think it's important. because, you know, sort of, again, it helps us manage our resources. But if we don't know what it is, it's hard to allocate the resource. I think there needs to be distinct clarity over these things and the spend allocation. I'd also expect to see in that plan any risk assessed. And obviously that plan also needs to have what the priority aspirations are for Transport for the North, bearing in mind its reduced, its potentially reduced capability. I also think, having listened around the room, that collaboration or co-sponsorship should be included. Just one moment. And there needs to be a clear definition of what all statutory functions are. So you just bear with me 1 second.
Sorry, Chair, it was something that Councillor Hughes and I were just muttering in the background before we started. What's been said is about if they're successful in delivering on the agenda, will they get more resources? Well, we would sincerely hope that if they're successful in delivering on the agenda, it doesn't mean that they then put in more cuts for them to achieve as well. Because at the end of the day, the budget is vastly reduced, and any more cuts will take it from the bone right down to the marrow. And we're really seriously concerned. I am, and I know that was something that Neil was in some agreement with me.
If I may, Chair, you're absolutely right that the board, particularly, and scrutiny, need to clearly know what co-sponsorship, for example, entails, because we're walking a tightrope here. And, you know, to echo Sean's point, we want to go in the direction that is right for Transport for the North. On the other hand, we can't afford to lose another tranche of money because we've alienated the government on a point we didn't even understand.
Thank you for that intervention. I think that finishes my comments. I'd like to thank you, Paul, for coming today and presenting what is a difficult situation. So thank you very much. Next up, we have Lucy Jacques with Strategic Transport Plan Policy Development, International Connectivity and Rural Mobility Policies.
Can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon. I'm here to talk you through the latest papers as part of our STP policy development. As you know, I spoke to Scrutiny in January, I think it was, taking through the first kind of policy positions that will feed into our revised strategic transport plan. And we committed to come back through Scrutiny and full TFN governance with some further kind of policy development we've been working up this financial year. So I'll primarily take the paper as read, but there are a couple of points I'd like to kind of address from the paper, and then as per the Chair's request, I'll address the comments from Anthony specifically as well. So just to remind Scrutiny, the purpose of this report today is to seek views on the rural mobility policy position statement, and that's prior to taking that through Executive Board and boards later this month for sign-off and adoption. It's to seek early feedback from Scrutiny Committee to the current draft international connectivity policy position statement, and that's prior to further revision, seeking some support from some external experts to provide check and challenge to that, before we will bring it back through the full TFN governance process, including Scrutiny, for kind of final comment and adoption later this summer. And as a reminder, all of the policy positions that we're developing, so these ones, the papers approved by board in February, and future ones will be embedded in the revised STP, and they'll be used by TFN and partners to shape our programme activity, how we influence government, and provide our kind of statutory function as part of the STP. So I'll move quickly to the rural mobility policy position, and there's just a couple of kind of key points I wanted to draw out on that one specifically. So the original STP kind of made a number of statements in relation to our role in supporting rural mobility, and the paper and the appendix, which is the draft position, draw that out. Specifically as well, both documents draw out several challenges that we face and our partners face in developing a rural mobility policy position. Those are covered in paragraph 3.2 of the report, and I'm sure partners are very well kind of familiar with those kind of issues. So I won't focus on those specifically. I think in terms of rural mobility, it's important for scrutiny to note that the paper that we've been developing aligns to some wider work we've been doing with the collective subnational transport bodies. So rural mobility is a key work stream for the collective SDB group, and TFN's work is very much framed within that space, but more specifically we've been working with our own partners to understand what that means for the North and what actions they would like to see from us moving forward within this remit. It's also important for scrutiny to note that in developing this policy position, not only have we worked this up with our partners through our strategic oversight group, we've also developed a rural mobility working group, which is a subset of our strategic oversight group and is made up of partners that have a particular interest in this policy area. The working group have so far provided check and challenge to the draft position and suggested additional actions which have now been included in the policy itself. Paragraph 3.6 in the report outlines that a really central part to developing our work within this space is, collectively we need to recognise that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to rural mobility, and that the definition of and geography of rural differs between places across the North. So what we're proposing within the policy and within the cover paper itself is that TFN embeds a place-based approach for partners serving rural communities, so focusing on the challenges and opportunities specific to each area. The paper also draws out kind of the key role that we see for TFN within this remit. And more specifically, paragraph 3.7 in the report draws out our proposed kind of actions within the short to medium term. So as you know from our previous discussion on the STP 2, the second STP, we're really keen to kind of turn our policies into action and really set out what is proportional and feasible for TFN to do within the short to medium term, constrained by our current powers and funding. So the actions identified in paragraph 3.7 are very much framed within this way, and I'll just briefly kind of draw out a couple of those. So firstly, we see a really key role for TFN to facilitate this partner working group focused on rural mobility, and that will enable us to kind of share best practice, collate evidence on what's happening on the ground, and think about how we embed that within evaluation and monitoring evaluation, so we can kind of really share those lessons learned across the North. A key part of that will be undertaking a call for evidence of our partners to understand existing rural mobility pilots that are taking place and how we kind of distill information from that and lessons learned in the wider sense. Another kind of key role for us within this space is how we undertake further research to support the rural mobility evidence base and demonstrating the rural need. So whether this is embedded within future research projects that TFN's planning to take place, but also how we use our kind of technical capabilities through our modelling to kind of better support business case development of that rural need. The rural mobility work stream and the actions as well clearly link across to a number of different work streams in TFN. So one of those being the work which I believe Matt Smallwood's talking about later on the agenda about the Digital Mobility Hub. So again, thinking about that piece of work and how we could look to pilot some of that to improve rural mobility. Similarly, planned work that TFN's undertaking to support partners with their bus service improvement plans, again, kind of clearly links across to the rural mobility policy we've been developing. as does some further work we're planning to explore citizens' engagement and developing a citizens panel for TFN. And again, that will help us demonstrate that rural need and build that evidence base to support partners within this space. Finally, there's two further actions that collectively with partners we've agreed are really important for TFN to continue to undertake. So one of those is continuing that collaboration with other SDBs. So how collectively do we work together to understand the issues facing rural areas and consider the transport infrastructure that's required to support those, and also think about how we work with government and the private sector to deliver kind of solutions within this remit. And then finally, the additional action that's been added as a consequence from the engagement with our rural mobility working group is really trying to strengthen how TFN will influence within this remit. So the rural partners within TFN see this as a key role for us. So, you know, we're committed to kind of exploring opportunities to do that, whether that's through an all-party parliamentary group event, whether that's further engagement with DFT on their emerging future rural mobility strategy, which we understand is due for publication in September this year. So really utilising that rural mobility working group, collectively agreeing some priorities and then moving that forward to make sure we're implementing our statutory function around influencing national government within this remit. I'm happy to kind of pause there if you want to discuss rural mobility, or if you'd like me to continue through the paper and then take questions after.
I think it'd be quite useful to just talk about rural mobility for a moment. Are there any questions? Oh, there's quite a lot of questions. Start from this end. Councillor Fenton, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the paper. It was good to see reference to the bus service improvement plans, and the report talks about supporting partners in implementation. I just wondered, sort of taking a step back, whether you have a sense of how likely it is that some of the extent to which the asks in the submitted plans are likely to be sort of facilitated by the delivery of funding from government, whether that's an area that you mentioned lobbying, that's an area where TFN could have a role, and just whether you've done any work to assess what those asks have been in relation to rural mobility. So as well as supporting partners with the implementation, what have you gleaned from the asks that have been submitted in the plans submitted by the LTAs? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I can answer that, or I can provide a bit of an answer, but perhaps not a full answer, and I might look to some of my colleagues waiting in the wings to kind of jump in. So in terms of the BSIP work, we have undertaken an initial review of all of the BSIPs that were submitted, so we can understand of the individual asks in specific areas and what has been put forward via government. So we've kind of undertaken that work and we've got a sense of that. As part of some of the additional funding grant that we've been provided through DFT, we are currently in-house working on a delivery plan with the department to kind of map out exactly what TFN's role will be within that space. More specifically, the question around within that review, how much of that links to rural mobility and what were the findings of that. At this point in time, I specifically don't know the answer to that, and I don't know whether anyone on the panel wants to add to that, but we should definitely have that information in-house and definitely can feed into this work stream.
I'll just come in briefly, if I may, just to help Lucy out with that on the BSIPs. We are using our analytical framework, and our aim is to, we've got a lot of the modelling tools developed already that we've used to support work on rail and highway, but actually to build in the bus network into that framework as well, and then use the outputs from that to support local authorities with their BSIP work. And the additional funding our aim is, and this needs to be worked through, enable us to take forward maybe 3 or 4 case studies or pilot studies in the next 12 months with local authorities in the north.
Thank you. Just adding into that, I am a bit concerned about the volume of work that you're taking on here. So are these projects going to be scoped before they're actually actioned? I am concerned that, yeah. Thank you. Did you have anything else, Councillor Fenton? No. Okay. Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions and comments. I'll rattle through. The first one is, I'm sure I should know this, but who exactly is on the Transport for the North Strategic Oversight Group? And therefore I'm interested in who will be on the Rural Mobility Working Group. Next up, in terms of case studies, I was just interested in how do we select which areas will be taken as case studies. And also there's reference on page 35, I think, under 3.7, that we will deliver bespoke support to individual rural areas. I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about that. I also wanted to say I really welcomed in the report reference to rural isolation, and I just wanted to sort of almost reinforce with that the importance of tackling that. There are different groups and age groups and such forth that are affected. As we know, in rural areas, most people drive, but for children and also even for young people in their 20s and 30s who are increasingly delaying learning to drive, we've got groups of people who are very much affected. Also, for people who are perhaps a little bit older, they can have, say, a situation where they are driving, where they are able to access things that they need to access, but then there could be health issues. So, for instance, if someone has a stroke or a problem with their eyes, and they may all of a sudden not be able to drive and be in a very difficult position overnight. So it's really important that we think about the different sorts of people who may be affected by that, and that we, when it comes to our strategy and such forth. So I just thought maybe that could be developed a little bit more. I also wanted, I also welcome the fact that there was references to rural deprivation, despite the fact that perhaps sometimes there are high average incomes. I just wanted to highlight, again, sort of really how much of a problem it can be in masking the fact that, yes, you might have a high average income.
Councillor Salter, can you get to a question, please? I'm very grateful for you highlighting all the great things that Lucy's done, but I do have to manage the meeting. So if you could ask your critical questions, thank you.
Okay, sure. So it's just if we could have a little bit more on the issue of masked deprivation as well, and also could we have a little bit, I noticed there was reference to the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. I wanted to make sure that we're not forgetting about other sort of rural areas of great beauty. So, for instance, the Forest of Bowland, will that be, and will other sort of areas such as that be considered, and make sure that they don't fall through the gaps. I'll leave it there for now. If I think of any other questions, I'll put my hand up later. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say, Lucy, you have an option to give written responses for a list of which areas that are going to be considered, etc. I don't really want us to, I don't want you to list all the names of everybody who's on a strategic committee or every village that you're going to be looking at across the whole of the north of England. So please just focus on the overview stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. I think on the strategic oversight group, like you say, we can send a list round of the delegation, but generally speaking, it tends to be the strategy leads within our partner organisations that sit within that, as well as the delivery bodies and DFT are represented, but we can send a list round on that point. The point around the BSIPs and how we'll select those case studies, again, perhaps if we send a note round on that, because I'm not the lead officer on that, and I'd be relying on others to kind of fill the information in on that. The specific points you're raising more generally around kind of how we will address rural isolation, how we consider rural deprivation, etc. I think are really important points actually, and I think are really critical that we make we build the evidence base around that. So we've undertaken a really interesting piece of work called Transport-Related Social Exclusion. I'm not sure if that's been through Scrutiny Committee, but that really strengthens our evidence base across both of those issues, actually, isolation and deprivation, and how transport can support or perhaps is holding places back within that respect. So again, I think what we've tried to do within the rural mobility policy is build on that evidence base, but we do note further work is required once it's been adopted. And then just the final point you made around, the areas specifically that we've mentioned within the document, and perhaps, we've omissed areas, really happy to take kind of further comment back via email in terms of any areas we need to capture. I think the thing I would just say there is the North is a very big place. There's an awful lot of beautiful places and rural places we would need to capture. So we do need to just make sure that what we're presenting is condensed within a certain respect.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Councillor O'Hara, please.
It's a general question. In view of the fact that the price of petrol is going through the roof, bus services are being cut because due to COVID and lack of funds going into bus companies, how is this all going to be dealt with this strategy?
It's a very good question, but I don't think Lucy is in position to be able to handle that question. I think that's more a question for probably Rishi Sunak amongst others. But I
appreciate that, but it's just that it's a very important part of the strategy, the rising costs that are coming through.
Do you have any comments, Lucy, at all?
I mean, I don't think there's a huge amount I can add to that. I mean, I think we recognise clearly it's an issue, and more so for rural areas. We can reflect that in the revised policy that we take through, but I don't know the answers myself to that at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Councillor Kaushak.
Yeah, you can take my comment as a question. We know the bus companies are struggling at the moment, but I don't see there is any funding coming, or you are going to subsidize any. So we are seeing the cut in the rural area is going to be, and how we can get the help. Yeah, you can take it as a question, and plus my question is on the fares, like as my fellow colleague said. Yes, the prices of everything is going up, and we are trying to say, oh, we're going to keep as the London, but there is no way we can keep it like London is London, and we are getting nothing. So how we are going to balance those fares? At the moment, if 4 people are traveling in a bus or a train, I think taxi or the own car is cheaper. So how we are going to balance all these things?
So thank you very much for that point. I think within these schemes of things, that when you're doing these plans, obviously at the end of the day, it's how the scheme is going to be financed. So Transport for the North itself is actually doing the strategic reviews. It's not actually going to be providing the finance. And one of the things that is interesting, I was going to bring it up at the end, but I'll bring it up now because fares have come up a couple of times. And this is around what I would call, there's a danger of duplication of work. There is, to my mind, in particular, I'm just looking at the 12 missions to be achieved by 2030 that is by the devolved authorities. And number 3 on that list, and I will make sure this is circulated to everybody in case you don't have it, number 3 on that list for the devolved authorities, i.e. authorities with mayors, is actually local public transport connectivity across the country will be significantly close to the standards of London with improved services, simpler fares and integrated ticketing. So that we need to make sure that we're not all being asked to do, so we're all following the ball round the field. Somebody's got to be able to sit down and say, this is my bit of this, this is my bit, this is your bit, etc. So I understand all the different price rises, etc., but I do think that this needs to be worked out as to who's doing the work, and then we get it allocated correctly. You also talked about call for evidence, and I think this impacts on the call for evidence issue as well. So I do think, but at the end of the day, I think somebody has to work out, well, what's the prize we're looking for here? Is the prize really close to the standards of London? And so somebody has to tell you what standard of, what is the criteria that your policy is going to be judged against? And I think you need to know that. So hopefully I've picked up most of the questions. I'm still waiting for you two guys to come along. I'm just trying to encapsulate.
I wonder if the government is actually aware of who funds local rural bus services. In my area, the key bus route between two of the main towns in the county is funded entirely by local people raising funds through a charity shop, because since the government supposedly rationalised funding for public transport, there isn't any available. I'm very glad, Chair, to have the Chancellor here as a witness anytime. Now, so yes, I do represent a predominantly rural county, and I want, obviously, TFN officers have a great deal to get your heads around, but I wanted an assurance that you fully understand how the government is working the BSIP and the Rural Mobility Fund awards. For example, Cumbria was awarded Rural Mobility Fund for a number of demand-related transport pilots. I think at least 18 months ago, and we haven't seen that money yet. And actually, the format of the pilots was dictated by central government and isn't at all what local members in Cumbria want. They want actual bus services, not services that connect to bus services that don't exist. But I'm sure you understand that. In terms of the BSIP, I think Councillor Fenton was angling at this point. Local authorities are asked to recommend schemes, but the government will decide which ones it approves of. And we're having that with roads funding as well. Now, and I think this leads on to a point I've made before at these meetings, which is if we're going to be able to fund public transport adequately from a pocket that isn't that of struggling local people, some sort of road pricing on a major scale will have to come in. Now, I know that TFN does actually back this, and the government did back it, but my understanding is that they withdrew slightly from this earlier pledge. Chair, I know it's not a popular policy, particularly with, for example, the hospitality industry, but actually somebody has to fund our public transport, and so far there are no takers for that. So that's really
Councillor Hughes, that's not really a point.
It's not a question. I apologise.
But it's also not a point for.
Yeah, well, the question,
I feel very sorry for Lucy that she's getting a point that is.
Chair, I apologise.
But how I would like to reframe what you have just said, if that's okay, is that in the call for evidence, it's important that you understand how things are being funded and whether perhaps a taxi or an Uber is a much better efficient. So in North Yorkshire for the moment, we have demand-led bus services, so that you phone up if you want a bus, and I'm sure it's not a double-decker bus that's trooping through the Dales, etc. So I think you need to be looking, I hate this phrase, but thinking outside the box to be able to cater for some of these other ideas that are there, but also the fact that perhaps not every bus service is funded by government, etc. The other thing that I would also perhaps add into this is that we should perhaps look at how much money local authorities are actually spending sponsoring various bus services, whether it's the school bus or whether it's the over 70s or the free bus passes. I know North Yorkshire, it costs £7.5 million a year to give bus passes to people who perhaps can afford, whereas the people who are just starting a job are the people, or maybe we have to re-look at how we do that. So maybe we have to look at current subsidies and how they are reworked in a way that's more appropriate. Would that help for you?
Yes,
sir?
thanks for rephrasing that, Chair. Suppose my question really to Lucy is please don't give up on road pricing, because if all the money we have, if we can only actually do research and no major projects, at least we can research on that. I'm captivated by the idea of the digital mobility hub. I'd like more information on that. I'm sure we all would, but it's worth remembering that in rural areas, first of all, many people don't have any digital connectivity at all, and there are others, as we discussed these fora before, who have very poor broadband connections, and therefore this isn't the optimal way for them to book transport. The question near the bottom of page, on the bullet point near the bottom of page 39 on the citizens' engagement work stream, is whether this is going to be TFN directly engaging with the public or through local authorities. Now, I would think the latter would be more practicable, especially given the funding cuts. In paragraph 4.8 on page 41, there's a reference to independent advisors, experts to support potentially difficult political decisions. Well, I'm curious about that. I'd like to know more about who these experts might be and how they will support difficult political decisions. For example, I'm not. This sounds hypocritical, but I've attended sessions presented by the Centre for Public Scrutiny, and those presented appear to have no idea whatsoever of the political dynamic. So yeah, we're a scrutiny body, but actually we're still politicians. I don't need to tell you that.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you to stop now, so
right.
that because otherwise we'll be here till tea time. So Lucy, perhaps you could, in terms of the experts, you could perhaps send a written submission as the answer to who these experts might be. And my final person on this particular is Councillor Sean.
Button, I do apologise. Could we ask that they look at augmenting it with people with some more knowledge of what's going to be happening in places like North Yorkshire, south of the Humber, Cumbria, Northumbria? Because clearly they'll have more idea of how things are managed in those areas and be able to deliver them. I'm a home man. I understand some of this because my wife's a Beverley girl, so I understand the issues. I've been consulting the 3 local authorities in my area because I'm also the chairman of the Bridge Board. So I have got some feedback on these things from colleagues from the other authorities. So I'll make the points fairly quickly. Number 1, we need to give very serious consideration to the fact that we need to be getting pressure applied by Transport for the North Board, given that bus and train services have been reduced in rural areas, both sides of the river, because they've said that they were struggling to be able to get people to operate the trains. Trains have gone down to 1 an hour instead of 2 an hour, most of the time on the North Bank, and I believe it's the same on the South Bank. The number of bus services there have been reduced. It's therefore adversely affecting a number of residents, and we need to make sure that we get undertakings that this will not be done. Because clearly, if we're going to be going to, which is my next point, onto modal shift, where we're looking in terms of trying to encourage people, rather than to be driving around in an old diesel car, to be able to go to using either an electric vehicle or using public transport for preference, we need to find a way to encourage people to do that. And that's, to me, is one of the key questions that they need to be asking when it comes to this. We also need to tie into what has just been said earlier. When I'm looking at my iPad on the way here today, diesel in my area is now past 181 a litre. So that's going to adversely affect the ability of people in rural communities as well to be able to gain public transport. So it becomes more and more apparent that we need to be getting better public transport in those areas, but it may be that government will, if it wants to achieve modal shift, have to consider putting subsidies in place for the operators of these public transports, whether it be trains or whether it be buses, if we're going to try to achieve that. I will make the point as well that I do think we need to give very serious consideration, and I ask that the strategic board look at, particularly in view of the issues around North Lincolnshire and North East Lincolnshire. They deal with a large part to do with us, but they are very, very closely linked into the East Midlands. And some of these plans that we've got are fantastic for some areas, but they don't fit in with certain parts of it. If you get to the southern part of Cheshire, that then feeding into the Midlands. And this is part of how we need to do it, in my opinion, and these are questions for them to be able to look at. And as I say, I think that it is just picking up to make sure we get the right answers at the right time, and I'll shut up at that stage, Chairman, because I think I've given Lucy enough ones to pick up on without needing to do any responses.
Yeah, so I don't want you to answer that one, Lucy. I want you to move on to the international side of this. However, I do want to rephase. You need to switch off.
I'll switch it up.
I just want to reframe one of the things there that I think is important. I did make the point before, and that is that it's about partnership, collaboration, and as your budgets have been cut, or our budgets have been cut, it's vital that that collaboration happens. And whether that's Sean writing you a strong, terse email or other things, but you need to make sure that in that pool of people, what is sometimes referred as partners, but make sure that that partner pool is absolutely correct. And maybe one of the things you need to bring is a list of who to a meeting is who's the partner pool, and find out let's ask these people around this table, have I got the right partners here? Because, have I got the people that know what it's like? Because it is different in North Yorkshire is a completely cosmopolitan. It goes from one person per, 100 square miles down to loads of people in the one area. So it's completely different. So please move to international. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. As I say, I think there's a couple of points I can come back at, but I'll do that via email. So the international connectivity policy position. So this is a draft position. As a reminder, we're not asking for approval of this at this point. We're merely sharing it to get some early feedback as we continue to revise the draft and work with our independent experts to further refine the policy itself. But again, a couple of key points to note before I'll kind of address Anthony's specific comments to scrutiny. So the original STP set out a high-level vision for international connectivity, and that was informed by TfN's Independent International Connectivity Commission report, which was published in February 2017. What we've been trying to do with this piece of work is to review that in light of all of the changes that have happened within the all the changes that have happened both as a result of COVID, Brexit, the environmental kind of considerations. There's a much stronger emphasis on now. So we've been trying to kind of review that in light of those, and the policy position aims to set out kind of some of that challenge, the kind of the context in which we're now operating, and we now need to kind of think about the TfN position in, but then also kind of try to draw out again, as with the other policy positions, what is TfN's role within this space, and what are the potential actions TfN can take forward, limited by our current powers and resourcing, to really kind of influence within this remit. As I sort of mentioned before, a key kind of objective for our revised STP is to turn our policies into action, and what the policy tries to do is to set out quite clearly kind of what our proposed actions and next steps are in relation to this area. So paragraph 4.7 in the report details that, and again these are the actions that can take place in this short to medium term time period and are framed by the powers and resources we've got. So again, I'll just briefly draw out a couple of those points because I think they are specific to what I'll cover in response to Anthony. So there's a number of kind of key actions within this remit. So the first of those is to consider how TfN can build shipping and aviation emissions into our models. and consider future baselines of our decarbonisation trajectory. So that plays into an action feeding from our decarbonisation strategy. Similarly, we're proposing to monitor accessibility to airports and ports by rail and road. So again, providing high-level accountability for surface access, which is TfN's current remit, and supporting the appraisal of schemes that will improve accessibility. We're also proposing to work with partners and key stakeholders to explore opportunities in threats to international connectivity. So that's not just the airports, the ports, but also the environmental groups, and I'll come back to that shortly. We're also proposing to support partners and stakeholders in their own proposals for decarbonisation, and again, that's in that broader remit. So thinking about their own aspirations, whether that's the airports or ports aspirations, whether it's our own local partners' aspirations on decarbonisation and how we support this agenda within this remit. We're also keen to explore the delivery of smart ticketing options for international visitors through collaboration. So clearly our airports and ports do bring international visitors in, and we need to think about how we support modal shift where possible. And smart ticketing is one kind of approach to that, I guess. In addition, also, we are considering further opportunities for the use of hydrogen and electric fuel sources within transport. So again, this stems from our decarbonisation strategy and some of the actions from that, but also the electric vehicle charging infrastructure work that I know Simon's going to talk a little bit later around. So there's a number of kind of areas of work there that we're doing across TfN that absolutely play into the development and delivery of the actions aligned to this policy. Similarly, TfN's previously done a piece of work around the visitor economy and transport and commissioned a research study for that. So again, there was a number of actions within that have been agreed through TfN governance that kind of set an ambition for that in the north in the future. And so we need to take into account the recommendations from those reports and think about how we support and embed those moving forward. And then finally, the additional kind of action within this remit that we're proposing is to consider the recommendations set out in our freight and logistics strategy, which is going to TfN board later this month for sign-off, in facilitating and developing partnerships to achieve port and port zero carbon multimodal corridors. So again, it's all framed within our aspirations about decarbonisation, but thinking about what we do within this space. I also think it's important for scrutiny to note, as outlined in paragraph 4.8 of the report, that this is one of the areas where we are planning to bring in 2 independent experts. At this point, I can't name those experts because we haven't finished the procurement process on that, but we should complete that within the next couple of weeks, and at that point we can definitely share the names of those experts. But what I will say is they're recognised within this field. They both bring a different set of expertise to provide critique and challenge to the policy position ourselves, but also in supporting us thinking about how we deliver the action from the decarbonisation strategy, which is to think about how we would build in shipping and aviation emissions into our models and future baselines, and as a consequence of that, you know, what other additional actions might need to take place and what is the role for TfN moving forward within that space, if any. So I thought it was important to kind of note that. As I say, we're currently kind of completing the procurement on that, and the next step, I guess, for this policy is for those experts to review it and provide some initial thoughts before we go back to our partners, the airports, the ports, the environmental groups to further kind of refine the policy itself. And then finally as well, it's also really important to note that clearly within this policy area, this is an international connectivity policy, it's not an aviation policy. Aviation is one element of the policy we're covering, but it's much broader, so we're also having to consider ports, the visitor economy, the economic growth aspirations, as well as airports aspirations and the environmental implications of that. So the fact that it's that broader kind of policy remit we're working in means there's a number of stakeholders we have to take into account. And so to feed into that, we have held initial policy roundtables with the airports and the port sectors. We've also engaged with the environmental transport organisations, so we have shared the draft with the environmental groups before coming to scrutiny, and we're in kind of ongoing conversation with the environmental groups around that. And we'll go back to all of those groups once our experts have kind of conducted their initial review, so we can kind of have a more detailed and meaningful discussion about what we do next. So they were the kinds of the key points I wanted to make in terms of the policy, and I know, Chair, you have asked me to respond specifically to the correspondence from Anthony with scrutiny around his concerns around the international connectivity position as it's currently framed. So if you'd like me to do that now, I'm happy to.
Just hang on. Are you happy with the answers that you've received in already, or what you've heard today? I just really want to expedite the meeting. I'm concerned that I've got another hour, and I need. So, are you happy with the answer you've had, Mr. Ray?
This is part of a conversation and a dialogue. We've given our views. Lucy has responded to describe the process that we just heard about. So I'm content for that process to continue and for your colleagues to have the chance to make their comments on the policy position as Lucy has laid it out. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, you can stop there, Lucy, for now. I'd like to ask a couple of questions first, and then I'll let you guys in. Thank you very much, Lucy. I appreciate you working through this. So, a couple of things here. The first thing is that on page 11 of your report, you talk about a rail-first policy. I think it should be, and I asked the group here, that maybe it's a public transport first policy. Rather than, because it's quite clear that we've now had the integrated rail plan and it's not going to be everything that it needs to be, and therefore maybe we have to look at alternatives. So I asked the question that it's maybe that. The second part I have here is about the visitor economy, and in particular, I think this is about knowing who the right partners are. So in Harrogate, and I know it'll be the same in York, no doubt, we have a very, very strong marketing organisation, because we have conference centres, and the number one thing about a conference centre, or the number one issue to make a conference centre successful, is accessibility. So don't matter how nice it is, if you can't get there, they don't come. So so make sure you've got the right partners there. And then I've got two last points, and these relate to sort of me being a bit grumpy earlier, to do with numbers and stats. You have a nice little box with ports and airports on it, but you had an opportunity in there just to say how much freight came through each of those, or how many passengers came through those, so that we have a scaler on that. So, because we need to understand how important or not it is. And then you're going down this rabbit hole of smart ticketing. We can't even get smart ticketing sorted for the land. So why would we spend money trying to get smart ticketing for international aviation at this point, international travel at this point? I understand the sentiment behind it, but I think this is where it's important that we have numbers and scalers, so that we can say, actually, it's much more important that we have frictionless payment for travel across the whole of the north of England, rather than actually for someone who's just coming on holiday, if you see what I mean. So apologies if it sounds a bit harsh, but I do feel that we need scalers in these things. Otherwise, we end up down rabbit holes. Councillor Chater.
Yeah, your button first, Chair. Quick couple of points. Number one, could I suggest on your table of the ports, you make it Humber ports, because there are 4. Goole was missed off, and our friends on the East Riding Council would be most aggrieved if I didn't point that one out. I do think that one of the key things, if we're talking about international travel, it ties into what we've got later in the agenda, is this issue about connectivity. If we're bringing in goods to the area, which we've got to talk about not just passengers but freight, we talked about needing electrification of the lines into the Humber ports. Everybody kept going on about, from my side of the river, about the line into Selby to go to Leeds. Everybody seems to have forgotten that our docks feed into Doncaster, and the South Bank ones do. So does Goole. So this is part of what we need to be doing. If we're going to be encouraging people to be transporting goods through there, it needs to be encouraging people to do that by rail. The largest single point for import of many cars in the UK, including BMW, is through Immingham and Goole. And that's why I make that point. The rest of it can wait for another agenda item, Chair. Thank you for your forbearance.
Thank you. Did Councillor Hughes, you have something to say?
Yes, Chair, I'll be very quick this time. First, just a factual correction, I believe. Lucy, top of page 63, second and third lines, air capacity in November 21 was 33% less than in 2021. I think it should say 2020, otherwise pretty meaningless. Page 66, I was a little worried by the top paragraph there. It says, inequalities and connectivity and economic potential across the UK, recommendations related to air connectivity. Now, I don't think TFN in any way should be promoting internal aviation. It's directly contrary to any decarbonisation policy. Yes, some internal flights are needed within the UK, for example, between the mainland and Northern Ireland, and in Scotland, obviously, it's not within our remit for the islands. They depend on those. But we have to be absolutely clear about this. If we've got a decarbonisation policy, we cannot be supporting internal aviation. I hope you agree. That's the question, Chair. And the final comment is on page, from me, on page 72. It's just a reference to the airport carbon accreditation and green port programmes, and I would like a bit more detail. Again, a letter after the meeting will be fine, but if we want to talk about those things authoritatively, we'd like more detail. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Hughes. Lucy, I think if you could respond to those in writing, I think that would be very helpful, as I need to expedite the meeting. So, Councillor Cooper, did you want to speak? Ask Lucy a question?
I do, yes.
Oh,
and,
so I apologise. Sorry,
just draw your attention to Councillor Salter as well, who's possibly out of your eye line. 2 points. I'll try and be brief. On the hydrogen, I just wanted to draw your attention to the existence of HyNet in Ellesmere Port, which is obviously a very important national project for producing hydrogen. And I know you mentioned the Humberside Green Energy project in there, but I just wanted to fly the flag a little bit for Cheshire on that. On the second issue to do with decarbonising surface transport access to Manchester Airport, Transport for Greater Manchester have done a great job, haven't they, in increasing the number of different methods by which you can access the airport from north of Manchester Airport. And in the report you mention about NPR or HS2 specifically. Just want to point out that none of this stuff is any use at all for Cheshire or for North Wales. If you're flying internationally and you live in Gwynedd or anywhere on the North Wales coast, your local airport is Manchester Airport. And to get the train to Manchester Airport, you have to go into Manchester City Centre via the infamous Castlefield corridor and then back out, which is no use at all. So I just want to make those points and hopefully be able to reflect that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on the decarbonising international transport, clearly international flights and whatnot are going to continue to have an important role for a long time to come, and we are probably a very, very long way off of zero emissions aircraft and such forth. As such, I was wondering if it would be possible to include references to carbon offsetting and carbon sequestration as, I think, part of this and something that will probably be needed if we're going to get anywhere near net zero in that respect. So it was just really to ask if that could be considered as well.
Please answer, Lucy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think fine to make those amends from our partner over there. I think the question around carbon offsetting and sequestration. I think, again, that will be something that we can definitely ask the experts we're bringing in to consider in terms of approaches and how we consider that. So we'll definitely bring that up, and hopefully when we bring the revised paper back through, we'll have added some sort of appropriate wording within the document to reflect that.
Thank you very much, Lucy. We'll let you sit down. Thank you for your time. So can I just ask committee members, do you want a 5-minute break? Because I reckon we've got about an hour's worth of business at less. No, you want to carry on? How many would, can I have a show of hands? How many would like a 5-minute break? Yeah, okay, we're going to have a 5-minute break, please. Foster to talk to us about the integrated rail plan and its update. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I will just do a very brief introduction of the paper given time, because this is an update at this stage. And really most of the key activities that are happening around the integrated rail plan are set out in some detail in the paper. I think probably the main things to flag, and they link back to Paul Kelly's item on the business planning. There will be the department now confirmed there will be a co-sponsorship function role for TFN. As Paul said, we're discussing that with the Secretary of State's officials at the moment. Martin's intention is to put that to the board as soon as he's able. The funding letter from the Secretary of State has allocated a funding for us to be able to carry out that role. I'm happy to pick up some of the points that were raised earlier about the co-sponsorship function, but I think fundamentally that is about ensuring that the North's voice continues to be heard in the development of Northern Powers Rail, even though the formal clienting of the programme will move to the department and Tim's team. Actually setting the objectives of Northern Powers Rail, what we're trying to achieve, ensuring that those elements of Northern Powers Rail that weren't funded as part of the integrated rail plan continue to be on the table, and we will do that through a combination of being sponsors for Northern Powers Rail, as well as through the development of the new strategic transport plan and TFN statutory functions, continue to argue the case for an enhanced capital envelope, so that we get the level of connectivity that we need that would have been delivered through the full NPR HS2 solution. So that's very much how we and certainly the board, when we discussed it with them at the end of February, saw TFN's role continuing, particularly around vision, but also continuing to push on delivery. So all the sponsorship function work is work in progress. The other big sort of big development is continuing to provide analytical support into the programme from TFN, and again we're working through the process through that work will happen. I think thirdly, just to highlight, there is a Transport Select Committee inquiry ongoing. There was input both from committee members and from the board into the submission that TFN put forward. The chair and the chief executive gave evidence in person to the inquiry. The inquiry itself concludes this month, and we're expecting recommendations imminently. I'll leave it there, Chair, and just pick up any questions.
Thank you very much, Tim. Councillor Chater.
Chair, I suggest that we note this. There's not much really for us to get our teeth into on this one. The time for us to be able to do more discussion will be after the Select Committee has reported. Because basically, we're completely... A friend of mine wrote, we used to lecture in gender studies, and she used the line of, I think it was Chamberlain, the role of the eunuch, responsibility without power, the role of the eunuch through the centuries, discuss. And I'm afraid that's what we all are at the moment. Until some steps are taken by government and by Parliament to deal with the issues around the absolutely abysmal decision about the integrated rail plan, then there's not much point in us doing much more than noting this. So I formally move that we do that, and without further comment.
Thank you very much. I don't need a seconder, but thank you for the offer. Are there any other questions at all on this particular issue? So, if there are no questions, then what I would like us to minute is our concerns about co-sponsorship and how we ensure that the North's voice is heard. That we would like to understand exactly how comprehensive the analytical support is, and that we know that the Transport Select Committee is ongoing, and that when we get the feedback from that, we'd like to see a report so that we can then discuss it with more meaningful input. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim, it's you again.
It is.
The next one. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, are we moving into the trade strategy?
Yes.
Yeah, can I just say that we only received this report online 2 days ago. I live nowhere near any council offices where I normally get my agendas printed. I had no facility whatsoever for printing and therefore for reading the agenda. I can't be expected to read 80 or 100-page document online in 2 days, surely with so many other committees. Now, Gary kindly... Well, sorry, Chair, this is a very important point.
Your comments are noted, and I will make sure that the fact that you didn't get it...
Well,
I would like it to improve next time, please, Chair.
I haven't even got it,
I
Chair.
can't contribute to this debate today. I'm glad to have the paper copy in front of me. I'll be reading it after the meeting.
That's noted. Thank you.
I haven't even got it.
Noted.
So I can't make any comments because I haven't been able to read any of it. I move deferral. And the fact that we haven't been able to have a copy to read and to be able to make comments on, I move deferral to the next meeting.
Any others wish to add that?
Are the timescales vital, Chair? I think that's the most notable point.
Tim, I think are the timescales vital on this? Is this going to the next? This is going to the next
It
board.
is due to go to the board at the end of March, yes.
Well, perhaps, Chair, they should have got the information out to us in a timely manner. This is not acceptable. As a Chair of Scrutiny, as Chair of Overview and Scrutiny at home, we wouldn't accept this. It's not good enough.
Thank you. How would you like us to proceed then, Councillor Chater?
I suggest that we refer to main board and say that as it hasn't been able to be picked up by scrutiny, we ask the matter to be deferred to the next their next meeting so we can deal with it ourselves. It is not acceptable to eliminate scrutiny from the process by just not sending it out to people until the last minute.
Okay, so my advice is that perhaps we could have a consultation call on this. If we defer it to the next meeting, my understanding is the next meeting will be the 15th of June, which is a long time hence. So we have three options in front of us. Those that have had the opportunity to read it have got an opportunity to input. We can request that it is deferred and therefore deferred from the next board, or we can do what's called a consultancy meeting. We can meet online. So I would like to hear what people think of those options.
If there are members who've been able to read it and want to discuss it today, I'd be happy for that to happen, but I suspect there won't be many of them.
In the interests of, moving on collaboratively, I suggest we go for a consultation call sometime between now and the board meeting so that colleagues have had a chance to review it properly, and then we can have a discussion about it then. We have the freight strategy has been to us over a number of times over the course of this development, so I don't think I don't think the contents is going to hugely surprise anybody. But that said, Councillor Chater is right, the scrutiny function is important. So if there is an opportunity to have a Teams meeting between now and the board meeting so that we can give our comments, perhaps that'd be the best way forward.
Thank you very much.
If that's the will, I'm more than happy to acquiesce.
Thank you. Then, Tim, we will arrange to have a consultation call on this. If that's okay with, well, it is okay. I think that's what everybody else wants here. Thank you very much, and thank you for pointing out that you hadn't received the detail. I'll now move us on to item 8, which is setting the scope and objectives of the Northern Digital Mobility Strategy, which I think is really frictionless ticket paying across the north of England. Thank you. So, Matt, I don't think you've been in this to us before, so welcome.
Yes, well, first, So if you just bear with me a second, I've got a brief presentation to run through. I'll take the report as read rather than going in detail and just sum up some of the high-level points from it. No, it's a tablet. I think probably in the interest of cracking on with things, I'll run through it without the presentation and have it on the screen here as an aid memoir for me.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll have to test things next time when we're in these locations. Thank you.
So I think some of the comments so far today have showed that smart ticketing is quite a contentious issue and one that TfN has explored previously. I think by way of background for this piece of work, I joined the organisation sort of late last year to pick up the area within which the IST programme once existed, to try and reposition and repurpose what TfN's position and role is going forward within the smart ticketing space. So I think the culmination of that and the various discussions, both through our exec board within TfN and with lead officers, which are normally your heads of ticketing or your public transport managers at each constituent member, has pulled together sort of a different approach to the programmatic delivery that the IST once represented. So I think the high-level purpose that the Northern Digital Mobility Strategy is setting out for is to inform and facilitate and empower sort of that local delivery. So under sort of larger pieces of work, the National Bus Strategy, Bus Service Improvement Plans, ticketing interventions are by their nature going to be delivered locally. And I think TfN's role in that space is to add capacity, help expedite that and reduce the duplication of effort and sort of resource requirements to deliver that local digital intervention and make the most of national interventions where they're being implemented. So, for example, the £360 million for pay-as-you-go on rail, our view is that we would sit as a bridging entity between that piece of work and maximising the benefits for local areas as that piece of technology is rolled out. So helping areas have the capability and capacity to integrate with that system from the earliest possible point. So I think the way that the strategy will intend to add value locally is firstly trying to scale and share existing best practice. I think what came out of the bus service improvement plans in particular is the breadth of ambition and existing ability to innovate in the north of England around this space. So I think rather than trying to duplicate or replicate that on a pan-northern basis, it's trying to build from that, identify opportunities to collaborate and scale where something has worked successfully in the north of England and develop an evidence base from those existing deployments that can be used by other areas to reduce their need to start from scratch with these ticketing interventions and to try and build some sort of uniformity and commonality to the data and technical systems behind them. I think there's some interesting points earlier made around just outside before the meeting around making sure that areas aren't left behind as technical innovations come through. And I think one of the key elements of this strategy is trying to develop that collaborative commonality in the technical systems rather than focusing on the end result of what a ticketing product looks like for a local area. That is for the local authority to determine. What I think TFN's revised high-level approach around this is making sure that those authorities have an understanding of the technical infrastructure needed and the backing to make the most of accessing that without having to start from scratch and invest in developing new specifications and new technical standards. And I think that leads on to one of the sort of other high-level purposes of this piece of work is to identify the areas for collaboration. I think under the bus service improvement plans, there was a lot of duplicated areas where sort of partners wanted to deliver effectively similar things, but were asked in isolation to fund those separately. So I think there was a large piece of work to try and look at how, if there's 4 or 5 areas looking to develop a similar seamless ticketing infrastructure for their area from scratch, if something exists in that space, how can we as an organisation package that and make the case for the joined-up investment around that bit of development? And I think the key part of this strategy, as opposed to the programmatic delivery of the IST programme, is this needs to be steered by what members want to do for their constituents in their areas and the technical systems that work best for their markets. We've had some very interesting discussions around urban versus rural, and I think that's why historically some of the one-size-fits-all ticketing options haven't quite worked, because the commercial markets are quite different in those areas and you need to have different considerations. So I think that member steer is really important, because I might know about ticketing technology, but I don't know what it's like to travel from A to B in North Yorkshire, in Cumbria. The people around the table here do, and this is why it's important that we're engaging through Scrutiny today to try and get a feel for what the important elements for us to start exploring that best practice and collaborative investment around ticketing can be. So I think setting the scope and objectives, the first thing is looking at the scope and scale of this piece of work. The intention is across all of what this output might be is it aligns with and complements existing work that authorities are doing in this space to effectively try and empower them to do more with whatever capacity they might have or limited capacity they might have in that space. So I think that's building on existing successes and looking to the medium and longer term foundations that they set for areas to start working more collaboratively to the next step of ticketing development. Now, I focused on the medium and long term primarily because there's a lot of quite rapid work going on in the short term, and I would be worried about developing a new strategy and that delaying some of that ongoing quite quick win progress. So we have parallel work streams. Colleague Lucy mentioned earlier digital mobility hubs, and this is something we've got additional in-year funding for to support primarily non-mayoral combined authorities in developing the supporting processes, standards, governance operating models for multi-operator ticketing, for example, to enable us to add that initial startup capacity to a local authority to develop those without us developing it directly and without that authority having to develop or procure the resource to do it in duplication with neighbours. So that's looking at some of those sort of quick wins that I'm keen aren't delayed by the development of this piece of work. This piece of work is very much looking at what those quick opportunities can enable in the medium and longer term for that broader collaborative piece. And I think part of that is developing this collaborative evidence base that I'm acutely aware that we've done really good work in the north of England on ticketing, but it has sometimes been hampered by the ability to cross borders or work collaboratively with that. And I want to try and use this as an opportunity to scale some of those successes, develop best practice, develop an evidence base to make it easier for other authorities that might be considering a similar ticketing intervention to be able to do that in a more seamless way rather than having to start from scratch with procuring consultants or external support to do so. And again, part of that is one of the hopeful outcomes of this is to start developing some common procurement frameworks and technical specifications that can be used by local authorities in deploying these systems. So the intention around this is not for TFN to deliver seamless ticketing, it's to facilitate easier delivery of that seamless ticketing experience at a local level, and to support that interoperability piece between regions and, importantly, between modes, particularly with the two strands of national bus strategy contactless capping and rail contactless capping under William Shapps. We want to make sure that both of those are able to integrate and interoperable as soon as possible for local areas. So with that in mind, I think the core objective of the strategy that I'm proposing is to simply add value, capability and encourage collaboration across authorities in the north of England around ticketing and digital mobility. And then supplementary to that, I think the strategy needs to be a catalyst for the sharing of best practice. It needs to be developed to reduce the duplication of effort, cost and resource in delivering these ticketing systems, effectively to enable those authorities with limited resources, and we've touched upon the pressures that buses under particularly, rather than using that limited funds to try and develop a system, they can develop a system that's already been proven elsewhere from an existing evidence base and invest that limited funds in the actual services being used by passengers in their area. And then finally, I think importantly, and touch upon that key collaborative delivery point of view, is to start making the case for this medium and longer term joined up investment in some of these technical systems, that instead of isolated bids for X piece of technology or X piece of technology that might not talk to each other down the line across sort of historical local authority boundaries, those areas that have common interests around digital interventions are able to collaborate and make the case for funding together in a more efficient and effective way. Now, the intention is that the structure of the strategy will be around three key thematic areas. The initial one being the future of ticketing systems. So that's looking at the kind of future of media ticketing, the media type, how tickets are sold, the payment and fares reform. There's some interesting discussion so far around the pressures fares are under. And I think whilst I might be head of digital strategy, one of the things I'm acutely aware of is digital is not the answer to every passenger's way of travelling on a ticketing system. So it needs to be a synergetic thing that links in with pre-purchase payment, cash payments in a seamless way as well. And I think one of the key elements about is trying to work out how that bridging between national strategy and policy, particularly around contactless on the railway, which is progressing at a pace, and the intention is for pilots in the north of England, that we as an organisation advocate for that, advocate for the interoperability of that, and work with our partners to make the most of the benefits that offers for local areas in that seamless ticketing. So we look at the onward travel opportunities. I mean, the tourism piece earlier is a key part of that, that if you're travelling into an area on the national rail system, what you want is not to have to go through more barriers to use ticketing systems bespoke to that area. And then I think the next sort of thematic area is the case and opportunity created through greater adoption of smarter and open data technologies and systems. The bus open data system has been a huge advance. It still has a lot of work to go beyond what it is at the moment, and the fares data that exists within that sort of opens up the technology space to start innovating and putting the power in the hands of passengers as to the platforms they use to access public transport. And I think that's quite in early stages, but it's quite an exciting piece of work to start looking at around what opportunities that offers for authorities to make the most of new modes of travel and the integration with that. I think the final theme is, again, the integration of future mobility systems and alignment with active travel. I think colleagues will talk about EV later, but I think there is an opportunity for ticketing systems and that infrastructure to start supporting a changed perception of the car, for example, as not the default mode of transport, but a more appropriate mode of transport as part of a package of modes you access through ticketing. Now, I think there is obviously the elephant in the room around our capacity and resources to deliver some of these things. The scale and aspirations of this piece of work, I think, is guided more by what our authorities need that added capacity and support to do. And one of the first sort of initial pieces of work that we're keen to do to get a feel on where the priorities sit for this strategy is developing a report which I'm sort of work in progress calling Digital Mobility State of the North, which will be a sit-down, deep dive exercise looking at what has been achieved in the north of England from a ticketing point of view, what wants to be achieved. So obviously a lot of that work has come through bus service improvement plans and some of the discourse around that. But what hasn't been able to be achieved because of silos of development or limited funding or limiting local capacity, and how can we as an organisation start work to add that capability and capacity through this piece of work. Now, I would say that is a very whistle-stop tour of the report and the proposed strategy, so I would welcome any feedback, questions or concerns from members from that.
Thank you very much. Whoa, look at this. You've got plenty of questions. I'll start with, I'll go left to right. So I'll start with Councillor Fenton.
I'll keep it brief, Chair. Thanks, Liz. I think you're right to focus on adding value and not seeking to duplicate, but I think there's a coordination role here as well, which, and I appreciate there'll come a point where the resource runs out and you have to limit yourself. I'm pleased you mentioned explicitly the tourism and the visitor economy. I think for obviously coming from York, that's something that we're very keen to engage with TFN and other local authorities with, because it's very important for it, as in many areas, for people to come, but then for people to move around seamlessly while they're here. And just to add, don't forget micro mobility as well, in terms of the dizzying array of ways that people get around these days. But thanks ever so much for this.
I think the micromobility piece is key, and I think one of the areas which we're keen to start adding that capability to authorities is not looking at specifying the ticketing result, but it's adding the ability to understand the fares modelling around these new kinds of modes of transport and what that means in terms of the pricing and pricing structure for those, and the added support we can do. And I think that's one of the key areas we're keen to explore through the pilot of the Digital Mobility Hub being funded by the department at the moment, to effectively add that capacity to authorities to say, this is our current structure of transport, these are the new modes, how can we look at the commercial modelling around integrating that in with that fare structure?
Councillor Salter, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say I was very encouraged by what we've heard so far. So there's a couple of things I wanted to say. One is that there's reference on page 87 at 1B to multimodal integrated ticketing fare structures and specific reference to bus, light rail, heavy rail and other modes. I'm particularly interested, and it's something that came up when smart ticketing was being discussed 2 or 3 years ago, that it's important we don't forget about things like ferries and, you know, we might be talking about a relatively small proportion of public transport, but still an important part of how people commute or leisure or whatever. So I was really just wondering if maybe there could be a reference to the sort of water-based public transport, and just wanted to make sure that's not forgotten about. The only other very brief comment I wanted to make is that with smart ticketing, I think once it's in place, in order to have as much buy-in from users as possible, it just needs to be as visible as it can possibly be. I think with ticketing, there's perhaps for some people a tendency to buy tickets the way they always have and not necessarily to make to realise there's new opportunities. I think also where this adds value is you could be in a situation where maybe you've forgotten your money, but you have your phone, and there are sort of new opportunities that we can make the most of. So just to say, you know, we need as much visibility as possible. But thank you.
Councillor Cooper.
Thanks. 3 things, if you don't mind. When we were developing IST, the Department for Transport, I seem to recall, had a similar project going on that was a bit behind us, which I don't know whether they're still doing that theirs or not. But how does what you're proposing here fit in with anything that they might have on the go? Do you want all 3 questions at once? Or?
Please do all 3.
Okay. Secondly, I can understand how what you're proposing will work for the areas that have got mayors, devolution deals. To the best of your knowledge, do local authorities like mine that don't have a mayor, don't have a devolution deal, do they have the power to put these kind of ticketing arrangements in place? I thought they didn't, but perhaps they do. And thirdly, if you're not proposing to develop anything yourself, are you proposing to set sort of open standards for data exchange that you expect local authorities to sign up to, so that they're all using, you know, common XML standards or whatever?
Yeah, I can take those quite quickly. I think on the first piece, there is a piece of work still ongoing with the department to work through the 2 strands, contactless on bus and contactless on rail. That's not yet come to a decision. The link in with this piece is where I think we are aware of it, and I think our priority from a TFN point of view is to understand the requirements needed at a local level to engage with that system. So rather than this piece of work specifying what that system will be, it will be us understanding the prerequisites needed for an authority to engage with it and to empower those authorities with that knowledge and added capacity as much as we can do to enable them to engage with that system as soon as possible when it's implemented on the bus network and similarly on the railway network. Taking the second point, local authorities do have powers around ticketing. Some of these have changed, obviously, with the movement towards the Bus Services Act and enhanced partnerships, but one of the statutory powers that TfN have in partnership with a local authority is the ability to create multi-operator ticketing schemes in an area, that power still exists. Now, I think there is some element unlocking funding under BSIPs. You had to go to an enhanced partnership approach to do that, but the underlying power still exists with an authority to create a statutory ticketing scheme. And then on the final point, if you could just quickly remind me.
I was just saying, is it what you're talking about, creating open
Yes,
standards?
yeah, and I think that's a really important part of this, that as that facilitative and coordinating role, it's setting guidance and standards that's easily approachable by an authority, so they don't have to start developing those standards in isolation. There's existing examples they can then use and focus their resources and energy and funding on the actual passenger-facing element. And it also encourages that cross-boundary interoperability as well if those systems are running to similar standards. I think that contactless piece of work will be a key lever in that because you will have to have certain standards of data to engage with it down the line, so that can be the stepping off point for that standardisation piece.
Thank you, really interesting.
Yeah, I just didn't know what ticketing is. Paragraph 5.2, the first bullet point.
Not a problem. It's mobile ticketing, so it's tickets on your mobile phone.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions for you. I sometimes wake up with a dream that tells me that local government's starting from scratch and that all I'm going to do is every local government's just going to have an app on their phone. They're going to have an app for planning, an app for this, app for that. We waste a lot of money on everybody having their own IT system. It's a real bother to me. So my first point is, why don't we, there's a tried and tested system that does the whole of London. Why doesn't that just, I mean, as it is, it's rolling up the country slowly. Why aren't we using that? So that's my first question. Why don't we just use what works? But what I really, some of the things that I'd like to understand is, and perhaps you might be doing it within your facilitation and your consultation and your coordination, which are all important points, is what are the pain points that we're trying to settle here? And you might want to do pain points in two places. What's the pain point for the customer? You know, and then what's the pain point for what I'll call your customer, which might be the local authority. So understanding what those pain points are, and therefore what benefits you're conferring. I mean, I guess this is frictionless. This is frictionless ticketing, as far as I can see. Not frictionless travel. Unfortunately, I'd like to see frictionless travel, but I think that's not beyond our remit. But frictionless ticketing. So I really would. So I think those are two very valid questions that you ought to be asking, and I apologise if you've already put them in there. But I couldn't see them as such. And please use the word pain point, because it really sort of emphasises, you know, what is it that, you know, what is it's going to make you buy this? Because otherwise it's pointless. Then the other thing is that, you know, we are very much concerned about funding at the moment, but an obvious source of funding here for me is that for the authorities like Councillor Cooper's, maybe the funding is that you can actually pick authorities that don't have the mayoral approach and actually help all those consolidate that so that it's one story that's getting dealt with. And we're preventing duplication, but maybe it's an opportunity to fund your operation. So those are the key points I would like you to just address, please.
Not a problem. I think on the first one, I might have to take it a little bit offline in terms of the London system, but my understanding is the approach in London is quite proprietary and quite expensive in terms of the deployment, and it has scalability with the network in London. It's quite tricky, but I might have to take that offline to look at some of the detail around that, but my understanding is it's quite a costly system to have and it might not be too suitable. But the core pillars of how it works can be translated and moved elsewhere.
We spent a fortune and abolished the system once, right? So I can't see how it can, at least, I don't see, I take your point, but, one thing that works properly is better than nothing that, spending all the money on something that doesn't work.
Yeah, I'll have a look at, I might have to have a look at that one, but I think that there's very discourse around the technical system at play. The second thing in terms of pain point, I think you've summed it up quite nicely there. There's two strands to that. There is the passenger pain points, which from my view are around accessibility and education on the ticketing systems that exist, and they can present quite a literal barrier in some regards. And if you have greater interoperability between areas, you increase that seamless ticketing experience, and you reduce the need for a passenger to have to research how to travel before they get to an area. I think that's a key pain point. And I think you've touched upon both in your second pillar there, but your final question, the pain points for our partners and authorities, it is that duplicated effort and trying to understand what is the most appropriate solution to deliver and how you can get economies of scale with that. And I think whilst we have large combined authorities with oftentimes more resource to deliver it, we have non-mayoral combined authorities that might not have the same capacity. And I think we are piloting this digital mobility hub as a concept to start exploring the support we can provide specifically to non-mayoral combined authority around this and try and get that uniformity so they benefit from those economies of scale to address that pain point.
Thank you. That's all. I'm just going to summarise these. So I think the things we need to note as a committee is it's a very important coordination role, particularly, and I think the fact that the mayoral authorities have got perhaps more authority to do things, I think that's important, that coordination, so that we know what's and collaboration, so we know what's going on. We welcome frictionless payment for travel. We think, and because I'm picking up from down this side, is that it needs to go beyond perhaps the bus and the train. And although earlier we were talking about aeroplanes, but maybe it needs to go to EV charging, your Boris bike, or whatever the latest vogue word is for a Boris bike, a bike you hire, and ferries. So, and then the final thing is that we want everything to be open standard, so as much as possible, it is fully interchangeable. So, thank you very much, and welcome for your first time.
Okay, I guess I can do the, I can make a start and perhaps we can work on it as I go. Thank you. So the purpose of this paper is threefold really. It's to outline the approach we've taken to build the first comprehensive EV charging infrastructure evidence base for the region, to highlight the key capabilities and findings with yourselves and some examples of those, and also to give you a summary of the next steps in terms of how we'll communicate, apply, and hopefully advance this evidence base going forward. So the report covers those three items. There is an Appendix A, which is the slide pack, which I was hoping to whiz through with yourselves. There's some really useful visuals in there, which if the screen behind me does its magic, I'll start referring to. But I'll carry on regardless in the time being. So just to set the scene and the context behind this one then, because I think that's really important. We applied our award-winning future travel scenarios to our decarbonisation strategy, two documents which you've seen over the last 18 months, and that helped us both develop a decarbonisation target, but also identify some of the priority actions that TfN as a regional body could take within that national and local activity sphere that's already going on. One of those priority actions was EV charging infrastructure and building a framework of evidence to support activity in that space. And feedback on the decarbonisation consultation pointed to that being a well-received action from TfN, and indeed one that we needed to get on with immediately in the early 2020s. My colleague Owen Wilson also brought the Major Roads report to yourselves just before Christmas, and that was a very integrated piece of work alongside the decarbonisation strategy. I guess two key things to point to there. It pointed to the economic underpinning the economic benefits of the highways network across the road in the north. 97% of personal journeys are on the roads network, 88% of freight goods are travelled on the highways network. So clearly there's a big economic place there for roads going forward. However, it also recognised that motorised road vehicles are a large carbon emissions contributor, and indeed around 6% of the total UK emissions. So a really big piece of the emissions jigsaw, if you forgive the analogy, for us to tackle. So all of those documents really pointed to a number of solutions, many of which are on road, and a critical one of those is EV charging infrastructure. In terms of where we are at the moment then, in terms of EV charging, so the North is behind the UK average in terms of charge points that we're seeing on the ground at the moment. The North's average is 28 devices per 100,000 population. The UK average is 42 per 100,000. So clearly there is a regional difference across the UK at the moment. And that's playing out in EV car sales as well. And there are some figures in your papers to point to those pieces of evidence. Uptake of cars, of EV cars, is ramping up actually quite significantly. 1 in 6 new vehicles are EV now across the UK, and clearly the charging infrastructure is actually struggling to keep pace with that. And that in itself brings a number of blockers to people wanting to take up electric vehicles. So this is the challenge, and this is where we've stepped in, and we took a lot of care to position ourselves in terms of what we could do in this space. It's a very busy environment in terms of what people can do around charging infrastructure, but clearly that understanding of needs was a particular gap that we thought we could fill in our role. So to do this, we built our framework, we built our evidence base. It's a regional evidence base that covers the entirety of the roads movements to, from and within the region. It covers caravan, HGV, and it's built with the region in mind. But it's built in a way that provides local authority partners with invaluable evidence and data to take their work forward as well. So that's the evidence that we're bringing to you today. Alongside that, we launched our regional EV steering group, which really builds on some of the collaborative strengths within TfN that you've noted today. Working with local authority partners, or LEPs in the instance of a few areas such as North Yorkshire, but drawing in our energy partners as well, our 3 electricity distribution network operators, and also our partners in the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles in DFT. So really building on what we've got and building that whole system approach. You can't tackle something like EV through the transport organisations alone. We need to partner up with the energy sector to take that on. Okay, we've given up on the slides. I just want to take a moment to note the engine behind all of this. So it's the TfN analytical framework, the modelling capacity that we've got within TfN that has been built over the last few years. This is really one of the richest data sets available for something like EV forecasting, evidencing at the moment. Not only do we have all that transport movement intelligence across the region, but we also have the social and the spatial elements, so that the housing makeup, the social economic details that we can pump into this, that give us a really wealth of information to take forward into this evidence that we've built. And simply put, we've taken that and we've built an EV model, EV charging model, that translates that into the EV charging requirements across the region and across the many different charging categories that you can see in your report. And we've done that because of our modelling. We're able to do that at something that's called middle super output area. It's an ONS classification. To give you a geographic example, it averages around 20 kilometres squared area across the north. So really a really usable level for our local authority partners to use, and that was really key. We then take that information up into the regional sense, and we can start plotting out potential locations for en route rapid charging, close to your petrol station type charging now, but something below 1 hour in terms of charging with the technology that we have at the moment. So really getting that regional picture, but also down to that local authority level as well. We have, as I mentioned before, we have evidence around our energy sector as well, so we can translate this charging requirement into what that means for the electricity grid now, and that's been really useful in our conversations with the energy sector. We can do that across our 4 future travel scenarios, which gives us a really wealth of information in terms of how we adjust to how the user might interact with the transport system going forward. And we can also filter it and do sensitivity tests around the different charging behaviours that we as the user might see going forward. 1.3 of the total car market, or total cars on the road at the moment, are EV. So we're really playing with a small evidence base at the moment, but this is giving us a lot more intelligence to make some confident decisions with going forward. So in terms of what we've got then, and unfortunately I'd love to show you the slides, but what we're seeing is really that electrification of road transport is going to need to ramp up rapidly. We are at a small fraction of where we need to be to meet our decarbonisation targets, and that is set out in the paper. So this evidence allows us to point to where we are now and where we need to be, but it also allows us to set out clearly some of the solutions and where the requirements and the need are. So we can break this stuff down by 5-year increments out to 2050. That's totally solved that one, isn't it? And we can do it by the different charge point categories. So whether it's charging en route, at home, at destination, at the supermarket down the road, we can plot all that out on the scale I mentioned before. Just move on a sec.
I'm very convinced. I don't think you need to tell us anymore. I'd like to open this to questions now, really,
okay,
seriously, because you've done a great job. Your slides are very good. What I'd like to say I like about the report is, first of all, you've set some targets. So I know that by 2025 we need this many chargers. So I actually got a target. I know something. I've got something to hang my hat on. So well done on that. That's absolutely superb. You've also listed what the priority actions are. You've also emphasised the fact that we've got a model that we can use and it's effective, and I quite like the piece, though I don't live in West Yorkshire these days, because they moved it as opposed to me moving out of it. So I love that public charging, that home charging, so I'd like to thank you for that. So I think there's a lot of positives here, and a lot of positives in how the report has been put together. So I'd really like to thank you and the team that have done that. I have 2 questions for you, and then we'll see who else has got questions for you. The first one is, surprise, surprise, we're behind the rest of the country with 28 out of 100,000 chargers. But if the national average is 42, what happens if you take London out? And I'm not asking you to do that calculation right now, but I suspect that if you take London out of it, it might give you a different perspective, and we might not look as laggardly as we are. On the other hand, politically, it might be better to leave London in and make us look as laggardly as possible so we can raise some funds. I'm not sure. However, it's just there. But I'd like a little bit more information about how you deal with this in the rural situation. Particularly, I've watched a couple of people who've taken EV cars and they've tried to get to the John O'Groats, and although John O'Groats isn't in our section, they've actually not been able to drive their EV all the way there without some torrid experiences and what Sir Alex Ferguson might describe as squeaky bum moments while they're trying to get to the next charge. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about rural.
Yeah, so really one of the key considerations coming into this was urban and rural, and particularly focusing at the private sector as well. So usually at the moment, what seems commercially viable is more urban solutions, and we really wanted to make the case for that whole network. So the evidence does allow you to get into the way we can cut it in terms of region, local authority, the MSOA I spoke about before. We can do that for the whole region, and so it's really for the first time starting to articulate that there is a requirement in the rural areas as well. As I think it speaks to some of the items we've had before as well, in terms of the importance that we link up with those two. If I can add, Chair, that one of the other capabilities we've got is to understand visitor economy as well. So we can understand charging behaviour against the movements on the transport network as well. So we can understand if people are going in and out of areas, so if visitors are going to Cumbria, Blackpool, Filey Coast, even Manchester itself, we can understand those movements, and that helps to shape local authorities' business models in terms of how they deliver this stuff on the ground as well.
That's excellent. I'm going to open this up for questions. Just one last point I want, I don't need you to answer this, but one of my biggest concerns is the number of these EV charging points that are broken down, and there needs to be some sort of Wi-Fi connection that continually tests these. I don't want, we don't need to be able to send men out to go check the report, whether they're working or not. There's got to be a smart solution to that. So if that's noted. So I think, Councillor Cooper, you were raring to go on this one.
Yes, thank you. I'll perhaps declare an interest and say that I'm an EV owner. In fact, it's my only car. It's a second-hand Nissan Leaf with its whopping 85-mile range in winter and 120 in summer. So consequently, it's something that I experience day to day. Is there a risk that that we're focusing on the wrong thing by looking at en route charging, because the rate at which the range is increasing on EVs, for new EVs anyway, is such that that given the likely timescale for local authorities to deliver this kind of infrastructure, that they'd be better off focusing on at home or at work charging in places where people can't sort themselves out, for example, in terraces, or encouraging leaseholders to sort it out in flats, rather than focusing on en route charging, which might be virtually redundant pretty fast. That's the first thing. And secondly, just to build on the Chair's point about whether charging points are working or not, has there been any kind of legislative proposal that you know of for this to require EV charger operators to monitor their equipment better, to have them fixed within a certain time period? I mean, there's a few there's 3, in fact, in Northwich that I know of that have been broken for about 6 months now. So, are there any kind of minimum standards proposed at a legislative level that you know of, or any kind of voluntary standard that we could perhaps promote in the north?
Yeah, thank you, and really helpful questions. On the first one, yes, our evidence points to it needing to be a mix of charging categories, charging types. Around 65% of the highways movements are trips that are below 10 kilometres. So these are the short journeys to and from the shops to schools, although we probably point to those also being undertaken by non-car modes as well. So yes, and home charging plays a great part of that, but obviously not everyone has off-street charging or parking capabilities. So public residential is something coming through in our evidence that is definitely needed. We have done the locations of rapid charging, mainly because that is TFN's remit in terms of our regional role. We didn't do the locations within local authorities because we felt that local authority partners were better placed to do that. But indeed, our conversations and the collaborations that we've got with partners allow us to use this evidence and move that on. So yes, definitely a mixture of charging categories, and that plays into the efficient use of this solution as well. So the more that we can link the cars to the electricity grid, the more we can be efficient and effective when we think about decarbonisation as well. The second question, which I've just forgot, it's just...
standards for maintenance.
Standards, yes. So again, that's come up in our regional steering group as a big issue. Maintenance is something that I think nationally the policy doesn't quite do enough on. It obviously is a big consideration for local authorities and a big cost, potentially. We are aware that the national EV strategy is due to come out very soon, and I think that there'll be something in there about maintenance and upkeep as well.
You, Councillor Salter, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got two questions. One for yourself, one perhaps not to address to Simon. So, for the first point, in a lot of rural areas, there are opportunities to apply for funding, perhaps from charities or wherever, to get charging points installed. And that can be done, say, for instance, if there's a local village hall or local points where people may go to, and you can have sort of little hubs with charging points. So I think the first thing to say is, you know, is there consideration being given to how we could make those sorts of opportunities more visible, engage with local decision makers and local councils, also even local parish councils or local groups that might be interested in doing that sort of stuff. And I think that sort of fits with some of the comments being said that it's partly about being aware, and I suppose for the users being aware about these opportunities, but it may already be the case that in many of the villages you would go to, that there is already a charging point, but people may just not know it's there, and so they may not feel comfortable investing in an electric car or making such a journey. So I'm interested to know if that can be explored a bit more. And then the second question, which may not be for yourself, but I think this is fantastic. Is there an intention to do any similar work to look at what infrastructure or whatever would need to be in place for hydrogen vehicles to become viable in the future?
Yes, thank you. I'll take the latter first. I can cover that somewhat and point to colleagues who can pick that up. So hydrogen is definitely, it's a separate programme of work within TFN, building on some of the strengths that were mentioned earlier across the region. We do, as the next phase of work of the electric vehicle programme, want to link up with that so that we do the, you know, a widespread alternate fuels view of the region, particularly on freight, actually. I think light goods vehicles might be electric, heavy goods vehicles might be hydrogen, but clearly there's an interaction there that we need to connect with. So I've probably answered that in part, apologies. On your first question around articulating the opportunities, yes, there are a number of funding pots out there, but by nature of, you know, funding pots and people being able to bid for those and obtain those, that they are very different across the region. I think there is an opportunity to get this stuff out there, communicate it more widely. Matt's digital strategy perhaps gives us an avenue to do that around letting the user know where the charging infrastructure is. So yes, for sure, and I think that's something that we can use our steering group perhaps to do and spread that across the region.
Thank you very much. I think that's us done for today. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Councillor Hughes, I missed you. Tell me.
Yes, I just reinforce and support Councillor Cooper's comment about offering a special assistance to those with no drives outside their houses who, you know, and the second point is on paragraph 6.1, the table at top of page 96, origin, destination, travel demand. This is probably another one of those terms that are very familiar perhaps to TFN officers, but there's no explanation of what it actually means. And it appears more than once in the report, and one attempted to surmise it means the obvious, but I'm not sure I should conclude that. So again, if we could perhaps have something after the meeting to explain exactly what that means. Thanks, that's great. That's all from me.
Thank you very much. I think we can, I think we'll call it a day if that's okay. Just to briefly summarise, we've raised questions around en route versus at home and at work travel, charging I should say, very much about standards for the maintenance, and I think that impacts on the fact that that would concern me if a village hall was able to have a charging point, but I don't know how it's serviced. So that's an issue there. But I think the report generally, I think we would all say the report is very good. As I say, as targets, priority actions, and yeah, it's well researched. So thank you very much. If there's nothing else, then I'd like to bring the meeting to a close. Thank you.